Hey everyone, if you live anywhere near Southern California, there's a good chance you woke up to this one. Early Sunday morning, July 12th, 2026, at 3:38 a.m., a magnitude 4, one earthquake hit right near Fraser Park, up in the mountains along Interstate 5. And within minutes of it happening, half the internet was already saying the same thing. This hit exactly where the San Andreas Fault meets the Garlock Fault, the most dangerous junction in the entire state, the place seismologists have circled in red for decades. Here's the thing though. That's not what happened. And honestly, what actually happened is more interesting because it drags in a fault most people have never heard of, a disaster from 1952 that still shapes how we think about earthquakes in this state, and a brand new study about stress levels on the San Andreas that came out just weeks before this quake even hit. So stick with me, because I want to walk you through this the right way, not the panic clip way. Make sure you're subscribed before we get into it, because I cover breaking seismic activity like this all the time, and you don't want to miss the next one. Let's start with just the facts on the ground. At 3:38 a.m. Pacific Time, on Sunday, July 12th, the U.S. Geological Survey recorded an earthquake centered about 1.5 miles southeast of Fraser Park, in Kern County, right along the I-5 corridor about 70 miles north of Los Angeles. Depth was around 13 kilometers, which is a pretty typical depth for a Southern California quake. Not unusually shallow, not unusually deep. The initial USGS number was magnitude 4. 1. Local outlets reported it as 4. 2 in the first hour or so, which is completely normal. Early magnitude estimates get revised as more seismic stations phone in their data. Shake Alert, the USGS's early warning system, put out a post-event summary that actually settled on a slightly higher number, 4, once it had pulled in readings from dozens of stations across the region. So, depending on which number you saw first, you might have heard 4, 1, 4, 2, or 4. And all three of those numbers are legitimate, just reflecting different stages of the same analysis. That's worth knowing, because when three different numbers show up online for the same quake, it looks like confusion or cover-up. It's neither. It's just how magnitude estimation actually works in the first few hours. The shaking was felt widely. Reports came in from Bakersfield, Tehachapi, Lamont, Santa Clarita, Pine Mountain Club, Lancaster, and Palmdale, and it even rattled dishes as far away as parts of Los Angeles and Orange counties. Shake Alert activated and pushed early warning notifications to people in the area who had the app running, giving some residents a few seconds of heads up before the shaking actually arrived. The good news, and I want to say this clearly up front, no injuries, no significant structural damage. A magnitude 4. 1 in a place like this rattles nerves and knocks a few things off shelves. It is not, on its own, a disaster. A magnitude 3. 2 aftershock followed later that same morning around 10:53 a.m. And other outlets logged smaller aftershocks too, a 2. 9, even a 2. 2, all completely typical aftershock behavior for a quake this size. Now here's where it gets interesting because this is the part almost nobody got right in the first 24 hours. The reason this quake blew up online so fast is location, location, location. Fraser Park sits close to where the San Andreas Fault and the Garlock Fault come together. Genuinely one of the most closely watched junctions in California seismology. So the assumption spread instantly. This hit right on that junction. It didn't. Within a day, the Southern California Seismic Network put out a preliminary analysis stating the quake was likely associated with something called the Plateau Fault, a separate structure that runs mostly west of Interstate 5 near Fraser Park. Not the San Andreas, not the Garlock. A third fault entirely, one that most people watching California earthquake content have probably never heard mentioned once. And it wasn't just SCSN saying this. Lucy Jones, if you don't know that name, she's one of the most respected seismologists in California, longtime face of USGS earthquake science in the state, posted about it directly, pointing out that a pair of magnitude 4. Ones that weekend, one near the western end of the Garlock and one in a swarm to the south, were neither one actually on the Garlock Fault itself. One looked like the Plateau Fault, the other was part of a separate swarm. So if you saw a video or a post confidently telling you this quake struck exactly at the junction, that claim didn't hold up under actual seismological review. I want to be straight with you about that instead of just repeating the version that gets more clicks. Because the real story here is genuinely worth your time. It's just a different story than the one that went viral first. Fair question. Because until last week, most Southern Californians had never heard this name. Let's fix that. The Plateau Fault is a thrust fault, meaning instead of two blocks sliding past each other horizontally like the San Andreas does, this one involves one block of crust getting pushed up and over the other. It runs for about 45 kilometers, and it sits near Grapevine and Wheeler Ridge, right in that stretch of mountains where I-5 climbs up and over the Tejon Pass on its way into the San Joaquin Valley, the part of the drive everyone calls the Grapevine. Here's a detail that actually matters if you've ever driven that road. Seismologists have pointed out that a significant rupture on the Plato Fault has the potential to make Interstate 5 impassable right at the Grapevine. That's one of the only routes connecting Southern California to the Central Valley and the Bay Area. It's not a fault that threatens a major city directly the way the Hayward Fault threatens Oakland, but it threatens a piece of infrastructure that millions of people rely on every single week. In terms of hazard numbers, the Plato Fault has a slip rate of around 4 millimeters per year, which is slow compared to the San Andreas. Studies of its eastern section show the most recent major surface rupture happened somewhere between 345 and 1,465 years ago. A wide range, because dating ancient fault movement that precisely is genuinely hard, but it tells you this fault has gone a long time between big events. The western section shows evidence of rupture more recently, in geologic terms, and the fault is considered capable of producing something in the range of magnitude 6, 3 to 7, 3 when it does go. That upper end of that range should sound familiar, because it's very close to the size of an earthquake that actually did devastate this exact region, back in 1952. This is the piece of history that makes the Plato Fault worth paying attention to, and it's a story that doesn't get told nearly as often as it should. On July 21st, 1952, at around 4:52 a.m., a magnitude 7.3 earthquake ruptured the White Wolf Fault near Wheeler Ridge, just a few miles from where this year's Fraser Park quake struck. It remains the strongest earthquake to hit California since the 1906 San Francisco earthquake, and at the time it was one of the most destructive quakes in the state's history. 12 people died. Hundreds more were injured. Damage estimates ran to roughly $60 million in 1952 dollars, which would be an enormous figure today. Tehachapi took the worst of it. The town suffered the greatest loss of life and structural damage of anywhere hit that day, and the earthquake didn't just strike once and stop. It kicked off a long aftershock sequence that ran into July and August, including multiple magnitude 5+ aftershocks. The strongest of those aftershocks hit on August 22nd, a magnitude 5. That alone killed 2 more people and caused an additional $10 million in damage, a full month after the main shock. That's a good reminder that aftershock sequences from a truly major quake don't wrap up in a day or two. They can keep producing dangerous, damaging earthquakes for weeks. Here's the connection to today's story. The epicenter of that 1952 quake sat right around the point where the White Wolf Fault may end or merge with the Plato Thrust Fault. Some researchers have even proposed, and this is a genuinely debated hypothesis in seismology, not a settled fact, that the 1952 quake may have been influenced by oil production happening in the Wheeler Ridge oil field at the time, since the main shock struck less than 100 days after production began nearby. That's still an open question among researchers, and I'm not going to pretend it's resolved, but it tells you this stretch of Kern County has a genuinely complicated and heavily studied geologic history, with multiple interacting faults, not just one clean story. So when a magnitude 4.1 hits on what looks like the Plato Fault, 74 years almost to the week after the deadliest earthquake this region has seen in the last century, that's a real reason for attention. Not because it means a repeat is imminent, but because it's a live reminder that this corridor has produced a genuinely major, genuinely deadly earthquake before. And the fault responsible for felt shaking that morning sits right in the same structural neighborhood. One more piece worth knowing, because it adds useful context rather than false connection. Within about 36 hours of the Fraser Park quake, a separate magnitude, 4. 3 struck elsewhere in Kern County, this time out in the eastern California shear zone, a different fault system entirely, well to the east. Seismologists were clear that this second quake was not on the Garlock or San Andreas either. I want to handle this carefully, the same way I want you to be skeptical of anyone who handles it carelessly. 2 moderate earthquakes hitting the same county within 2 days sounds dramatic. But Kern County sits inside one of the most seismically active corridors in the entire state. You've got the White Wolf Fault, the Plato Fault, the Garlock Fault, the Southern Sierra Nevada Fault System, and the Eastern California Shear Zone, all crammed into a relatively compact area. 2 unrelated faults producing 2 unrelated moderate quakes within 36 hours is not, by itself, evidence those events are talking to each other. Sometimes a seismically busy region just has a busy weekend. That's worth saying plainly, instead of stringing it into a bigger story it doesn't actually support. Now, here's where I do want to bring in something genuinely significant, not because it's connected to this specific quake, but because it's real, recent, peer-reviewed research that deserves attention on its own. Just weeks before the Fraser Park earthquake, researchers published a study modeling roughly 1,000 years of earthquake activity and stress accumulation across the southern San Andreas and San Jacinto fault systems. The findings: current stress levels along the San Jacinto Fault's San Bernardino segment are now sitting at or above anything recorded across that entire 1,000-year modeled history. That's a striking result on its own merits, published independent of anything happening in Kern County this month. To be precise about what this does and doesn't mean, neither the Fraser Park quake nor the Eastern California shear zone quake that followed it struck the San Andreas or San Jacinto faults that this study is actually about. Seismologists who looked at both events were direct about that. What connects them isn't a shared cause. It's that they're happening in the same broad Southern California fault corridor, at a time when we now have solid, independently derived evidence that part of that corridor is under record-level stress. That's a meaningful piece of context to hold in your head. It's not a prediction, and it's not evidence that this month's small quakes triggered anything on the San Andreas. It's simply true and worth knowing on its own. And this is where the Garlock Fault comes back into the conversation, because even though it wasn't involved in this month's quakes, everything we already knew about it before July 12th is still true today. The Garlock is a left lateral strike-slip fault that runs roughly east-west, cutting into the San Andreas system. The paleoseismic record, physical evidence of ancient earthquakes preserved in soil and rock layers, shows past ruptures on the Garlock involving 2 to 3 meters of displacement, consistent with earthquakes in the magnitude 7, 5 range. And there's no record of the Garlock producing an earthquake anywhere near that size within the actual historic period we have records for. Current estimates put the gap, since its last major rupture, somewhere between 500 and 1,000 years. Back in 2019, the magnitude 7, one Ridgecrest earthquake, the strongest to hit California in over 2 decades at that point, increased accumulated stress on the Garlock Fault by roughly 30%, according to USGS calculations. That was true in 2019, it remained true through 2025, and nothing about this month's Plato Fault quake changes that underlying picture one way or the other. The Garlock is still overdue. It just wasn't what shook Fraser Park on July 12th. I want to take a second on this because I think it's the most important point in the whole story, more important than any single fault name. When early reports and social media posts said this quake hit exactly at the San Andreas Garlock junction, that wasn't a harmless simplification. It changes the entire hazard picture people walk away with. A magnitude 4 something on the Plato Fault tells you something specific about a thrust fault system near Grapevine with its own separate history, its own separate hazard profile, and its own connection to the 1952 disaster. A magnitude 4 something exactly on the San Andreas Garlock junction would have been a genuinely different and more urgent signal, because that junction has sat quiet at this magnitude for over 26 years and represents one of the tightest structural bottlenecks in the entire California fault network. Confusing the two doesn't just get a name wrong, it tells people to worry about the wrong system, while the fault that's actually most overdue, the Garlock, quietly stays out of the conversation entirely. Seismologists working this event were consistent on one more point too. Earthquakes of this size are relatively common in Southern California, and smaller events like this one don't reliably indicate that a larger earthquake is imminent. Roughly 15 to 20 earthquakes reach magnitude 4, 0 or greater in California in a typical year. Only Alaska sees more earthquakes annually than California does anywhere else in North America. A magnitude 4. 1 is a real, felt, newsworthy event, and it is also statistically something this state produces more than once a month on average. So let's put the honest version of this together. On July 12th, a moderate earthquake struck near Fraser Park, most likely on the Plato Fault, a thrust fault capable of magnitude 6, 3 to 7. 3 events sitting in the same structural neighborhood as the deadly 1952 Kern County earthquake, in a spot that could genuinely disrupt I-5 traffic through the Grapevine if it ever ruptures at full size. It was not the San Andreas Garlock junction, despite what a lot of early coverage assumed. A second, unrelated moderate quake hit the Eastern California shear zone about a day and a half later. And independent of both of those events, a legitimate new study says stress on part of the San Jacinto fault system is at its highest modeled level in 1,000 years. A genuinely important finding on its own, just not one caused by or proven by this month's Kern County activity. Meanwhile, the Garlock Fault, still genuinely overdue for a major rupture, wasn't part of this story at all, no matter how many headlines implied otherwise. That's a lot more nuanced than the most dangerous junction in California just went off. But it's true, and I'd rather give you true than give you viral. None of this changes the baseline advice, though, and this is where I want to leave you. Southern California sits on top of a genuinely complicated, genuinely active network of faults. Some famous, like the San Andreas, and some, like the Plato, that most people have never heard of until the week they make news. You don't need to know every fault name to be ready. You need a plan. Keep a basic emergency kit ready. Food, water, and basic medical supplies to last several days at minimum. A hand crank radio is genuinely useful if the power grid goes down for an extended stretch. A backup battery pack, ideally paired with a small solar charging setup, can keep phones and essential devices running when the grid doesn't cooperate. Know the safest spot in your home to shelter, under sturdy furniture, away from windows and anything tall enough to fall on you. If you're in an older building, it's worth finding out whether it's been retrofitted to modern seismic code, because older unreinforced structures consistently fare worse in strong shaking. Agree on an out-of-area emergency contact with your family now, before phone networks get overloaded, because they do get overloaded in the first hour or two after anything significant. And, if you haven't already, sign up for your region's earthquake early warning alerts. Sometimes that's just a few seconds of notice, but a few seconds is enough time to drop, cover, and hold on before the worst of the shaking arrives. I'll keep watching this one. If the aftershock pattern on the Plato Fault develops into something worth another video, or if researchers publish anything more specific connecting this event to the broader stress picture across Southern California, I'll bring you the update, and I'll give it to you the same way I gave you this one, sourced, checked, and without turning a real earthquake into a bigger story than the evidence actually supports. As it says in Psalm 46, God is our refuge and strength, an ever-present help in trouble. Therefore we will not fear, though the earth give way and the mountains fall into the heart of the sea. That's not a promise that the ground won't shake. It's a reminder of where to stand when it does. Be ready, look out for your neighbors, and don't let fear get ahead of the facts. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next update, and I'll see you in the next one. Stay safe out there.